Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to another edition of AP Vocabulary. Today we will be discussing quite a few terms and people and events that were taking place after World War I. So we are going to be looking at the big picture first and then kind of going into some minor details and then kind of reminding you of the big picture. So the big idea behind World War I and what most people think of is the fighting that took place in Europe in the trenches between European powers and the devastating losses that took place there. But this video is focused on what was going on elsewhere in the world, especially after the war was over, and some of the movements that were being made in order to loosen the grip that the Europeans had on their colonies and the places that had been kind of imperialized or taken over by the Europeans. So we're going to look particularly at India, looking at the National Congress Party that emerged, B.G. Tilak and Mohandas Gandhi as moving India toward independence. We're going to look at the Middle East, particularly the new Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal or Ataturk. And then we will look at Egypt and the Dinshawai incident and the new nationalist movement that was moving Egypt toward independence. And we'll also look at Palestine and the Jewish movement toward an independent state in Palestine, and particularly looking at the Balfour Declaration. And finally we'll end with Pan-African organizations and nationalist movements in Africa in order to get independence for colonies of Europe in Africa. So it's kind of a lot to look at, but the big picture idea here is that many of these colonial holdings of Europeans, especially the British and the French, were starting to realize that they wanted to gain independence and run their own countries and have what was called self-determination, which is they get to determine for themselves how they want to rule and lead their countries. And this would lead to eventual independence on most of these nations' parts, but it did not happen all right away. So let's start with India and do some real vocabulary words here. So India, even before World War I had started, had what was called the National Congress Party. And the National Congress Party was made up of educated Indians, usually of the elite class, who were able to meet and discuss issues and bring some of those issues to the British government, who was controlling India. This was a very gradual approach to getting issues resolved, and they were not necessarily focused on independence. But in the long run, they did see this National Congress Party as a way to eventually get self-determination and be able to rule India independently from the British. So it was kind of an important Kickstarter for getting Indian independence. Then came some some people who made big impacts on the movement toward Indian independence and self-determination. And one of the first ones was a guy by the name of B.G. Tilak. And B.G. Tilak was a Hindu, and he was a Hindu nationalist. And so his strategy revolved around promoting the Hindu unity and therefore Indian nationalism under the Hindu banner, and oftentimes would promote violent rebellion or urge violent rebellion if their goals were not being met. And so Tilak was important because a lot of people did get behind his movement, but it was mostly localized around his area of influence. And his militant action or promotion of more violent or militant action was frowned upon by many people, the British and some of the Indians. And so his appeal was not widespread enough to reach Muslims in India, who made up almost 25% of the population, and so they did not rally around this Hindu nationalist as much. And the next guy who kind of gained more ground and became the major fighter for Indian independence was Mohandas Gandhi. So Gandhi was an Indian educated lawyer who took up the cause for Indian independence and promoted a little bit more unity among the nationalist movement. So He was famous for trying to promote Hindu-Muslim unity for the struggle for independence and to try to make sure that he did not stand for one religious group. He took on actions that were not militant and violent. They were peaceful, but they were also somewhat radical. And so his call for nonviolent resistance appealed to many Indians, but it also appealed to the softer side of the European powers, who couldn't go up and prevent Gandhi from doing things like a hunger strike or a walkout, especially if he was being nonviolent, because any act of aggression would be seen as kind of unfair to the rest of the world. So Gandhi really kind of mobilized the movement toward nationalism, and eventually India would win their independence from the British, but it wouldn't be until after World War II. So this was the beginnings of the Indian independence movement. All right, elsewhere in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, the former Ottoman Empire, which had been defeated during World War I, gained independence as the Turkish Republic under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk as he is known. And this was significant because the Turkish Republic really modeled itself after what the Ottoman Empire, what the Young Turks had been trying to accomplish in the Ottoman Empire, which was Western-style reforms, a constitutional government, and a republic style of government, which was kind of more progressive and fair to the people. So it gave reforms, voting reforms, and allowed women more freedom, and was kind of a progressive approach to ruling this new nation of Turkey. Now, the people who had fought against Turkey or the Ottoman Empire in World War I had been promised by the British a number of things. And British promises, and really European promises that were made during the war, is kind of one of the reasons that a lot of people became upset with them, because they didn't honor a lot of their promises after the war was over. So in one of these places, let's consider Egypt first. So Egypt was occupied by the British and really completely controlled by the British, and they had wanted to gain more independence after the war, and they were really starting to struggle against the British, partially because of British racism and unfair actions in government. So the Dinshawai incident, or the Dinshawai incident, kind of showed how the Europeans were being unfair to the Egyptians. This happened because a hunting party went out in Egypt, and they went out to go kill some pigeons, which the locals relied on for food. They accidentally shot an important woman in the community. Actually, it was the wife of a very important leader in Egypt, and killed her. And the Egyptians in the area got very upset and kind of attacked this hunting party. Multiple people died on both sides. It was a horrible incident, which was technically just a mistake, but the British response was to execute those Egyptians who were a part of the gangs who attacked this hunting party. And so the executions of these local Egyptians, who were only reacting to the fact that the Europeans had killed one of their own, really clearly sent the message to the Egyptians that the British and the Europeans felt like they were superior to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians really kind of held on to this bitterness, and after the war really started to push for independence and decolonization, getting the British out of there. The British slowly decolonized in Egypt, and as the Egyptians took control of themselves, conditions really didn't improve for the peasantry and the mass majority of the population. They were still, for the most part, illiterate. They were still very poor. They were still having a hard time making ends meet. The only thing that had changed is this new ruling class in Egypt that took over was taking over for the British and taking kind of all of the benefits for themselves and not spreading them out to the rest of the people in Egypt. Elsewhere, let's look at the plight of Palestine and the Jews in Europe, and how the Middle East and the Jews in Europe are related. So early on, because of a lot of violence and discrimination against Jews in Europe, in Russia, and in Western and Eastern Europe, Jews were beginning to migrate and have this movement back toward a Middle Eastern homeland from which the Jews were dispersed from centuries before. And so this movement was urged on by Jewish leaders, and eventually they caught the ear of the British and before the war. So there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, and the Dreyfus affair was a little bit like the Dinshawai incident, which showed how much hatred there was for Jewish populations in Europe. So the Dreyfus affair was a French, what was he? He was I think he was a ship captain, and his name was Alfred Dreyfus. He was a Jew. He was accused of spying. He was told, they said he was sending messages to the Germans, and they convicted him of this crime, and all sorts of people across France started to shout really anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish remarks, and it kind of showed the underlying hatred that these Christian Europeans had for these Jewish Europeans. And so this, even though he was actually innocent, he was found later to not have any guilt in this situation, and so it really showed that the Jews wanted to get out of there and form their own homeland. So the British had promised in something called the Balfour Declaration that the Jews, they would seek a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, and the Jews they would start to work toward making that happen for the Jewish people. So Jewish communities started to move to the Middle East and started to buy up land or migrate into the Middle East and into Palestine and start to set up settlements as early as World War I. And this promise, the Balfour Declaration, was not honored as well, because the Europeans had also promised the Arabs in that area that they would honor their requests for land and not give it away. And so the Europeans were in a bind because they had made so many promises to the peoples who were seeking self-determination, and they weren't granting it to them. So they were holding on to power as much as they could. This also happened in Africa, and it's the last place we'll end this video at. Africa was colonized by many different European nations, but there was a movement, mainly by people outside of Africa, but also by some people inside of Africa, for Pan-African organizations. And these Pan-African organizations were an attempt to unite all African peoples in order to promote self-determination in Africa and decolonization so that they could rule themselves again. The problem with these Pan-African organizations is Africa is very big. It's a very big place, and it's very diverse geographically, ethnically, and religiously, and so a lot of the people didn't have true unity, and a lot of these people who were promoting Pan-African organizations didn't even live in Africa. Many of them were African Americans or West Indians, and wanted to see Africans unite, but it was much more difficult to do than one might think, because Africa's so immense. And so what ended up happening is localized nationalist movements in different colonies started to gain more power and voice. But none of these African nations, save Egypt, which is in the Middle East and Africa, really gained any independence or movement toward freedom. They would later, after World War II, again, get their independence. So many of these places that we've talked about, the African colonies wouldn't gain independence until after World War II, and sometimes not until the 1970s. Israel, the Jewish homeland, was not created until after World War II. India was not freed from colonial rule until after World War II, and really even Egypt, which had gone through anti or decolonization, did not really gain full independence or reform until after World War II. So it's kind of a lot of information, but the big picture is that after World War II, a lot of these places around the world that had been colonized by European powers were attempting to form independence movements, were attempting to gain nationalist support, widespread support for these movements for independence. And eventually, most of these places after World War II would gain their independence and decolonization as we move into the modern world. All right, Peace, love, and be awesome.